Welcome and thank you for joining this election official security interview to speak with two former election officials and a law enforcement officer about ongoing threats against election officials. I am Thomas Hicks, Chairman of the United States Election Assistance Commission. For those of you not familiar with our agency, the EAC is an independent bipartisan federal agency responsible for helping Americans participate in the voting process. We work closely with state and local election officials and provide resources to help them make sure everything is in order for voters to cast a meaningful, secure, and independent ballot. Among our newest resources is a guidance for election workers to address the growing number of threats against the physical safety for simply meeting their obligations to serve voters in their communities. In November of 2021, the EAC launched our Security Resources for Election Officials webpage. This guide serves as a reference for election officials who may be facing personal threats in the workplace. We recently updated this comprehensive resource to include additional information from the FBI and Department of Justice. Information to law enforcement, physical security best practices, helpful toolkits, and updates from our federal partners. Looking forward, we anticipate ongoing collaboration with the Department of Justice and the FBI for similar joint initiatives. We also plan to engage the EAC Board of Advisors, Standards Board, and Local Leadership Council to further analyze the overall threat landscape. But we're here today to learn from election officials and law enforcement who experience these threats firsthand. So let me welcome our panelists. Sheriff Peter Koutoujian leads the Middlesex Sheriff Office in Massachusetts. As sheriff, Mr. Koutoujian use of special units has reimagined the correction landscape by targeting treatment towards unique populations such as young adults and military veterans. These programs have directly and substantially reduced recidivism in their participation. These results have been published in academic journals, featured in national news outlets, and labeled as best practices by multiple presidential administrations. He's not only an expert in law enforcement, but also a former state representative who chaired the Committee on Health Care, where he advocated for families and frontline workers on issues of mental health, school nutrition, nursing, opioid and tobacco use, suicide awareness, domestic violence prevention, pandemic response, crime proliferation, rape by fraud, and more. Sheriff Koutoujian holds a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, a law degree from New England School of Law, and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Bridgewater State University. Chris Harvey is a deputy director with the Georgia Police Officers Standards and Training Council. Before joining the council, he was appointed state election director for the Georgia State Secretary of State's office. His background also includes experience in law enforcement, having served as a DeKalb County police officer in 1994. He served terms as a chief investigator for DeKalb County's DA office, the director of cold case homicide squad for the Fulton County DA's office, and the chief investigator for the Secretary of State's office. Mr. Harvey earned a BA in political science and criminal justice from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina in 1989. He attended graduate school and taught high school before embarking on his career in law enforcement and elections. Finally, Neal Kelley joins us for this panel. Neal is a retired Registrar of Voters for Orange County, California, the 5th largest jurisdiction in the United States, serving more than 1.9 million registered voters. In his role as the county's chief election officer, he led an organization responsible for conducting elections, verifying petitions, and maintaining voter records. Mr. Kelley is a former appointee and founding member of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Election Task Force Government Coordinating Council, GCC, where he helped to oversee the protection of the nation's election infrastructure. He also served as a member of and past chair of the EAC's Board of Advisors, and is a former member of the EAC Standards Board and a former member of the EAC's Technical Development Guidelines Committee. In addition, he served as a member of the 2018 Academic of Science, Engineering, and Medicines Committee of the Future of Voting. Mr. Kelley earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business and Management from the University of Redlands and holds an MBA from the University of Southern California. I'd like to begin by taking the initiative, or by talking about the initiative all three of you have started in this very issue of threats to election workers, the Committee on Safe and Secure Elections. Neal, as the current chairman of this committee, can you please start and tell us about how this committee formed and its role, and how its role will play in addressing these threats moving forward?
Well, Commissioner, first of all, thank you so much to you and the EAC for hosting this video today and allowing us to share our thoughts. I really am appreciative of your constant focus on the election administration landscape and the needs for support. This committee came together following the 2020 election as we move into the 22 election for a number of reasons. Most focused on certainly threats to election officials. The committee itself is made up of 32 former and current election officials, elected sheriffs, chiefs of police, and other law enforcement members that make up the entire committee. The goal of the committee is to do a couple of things. First is to raise awareness on this issue. I think that's first and foremost, that's really important. The second is to provide products and services that can really be valuable for not only election officials, but law enforcement partners across the country. And then the third is to just make sure that there's proper training, proper checklists, proper procedures that are in place at election offices to make sure that the risk is reduced. We can't eliminate it, but we certainly can reduce the risk. And I think that's an important point. The committee itself was formed by 4 organizations in this space, the election space: the Brennan Center for Justice, R Street Institute, Protect Democracy, and the Elections Group. And the one thing that I want to say about the committee before I turn over to my colleagues is that I believe it's very unique in that we're made up of law enforcement and election officials. You're seeing a lot of folks entering this space across the country, which is great. But to have these men and women at the table talking about these issues is extremely important. And thank you again.
Would either of you like to address that as well?
I'll just say a little bit. It's funny, when I left, I was the state election director in Georgia from 2015 until mid-2021, during which time there was just unprecedented scrutiny and tumult in Georgia that sort of culminated in the 2020 general election and then the runoff and some threats. I experienced some threats myself, but in talking with the 159 county election directors in Georgia, I noticed that they were getting a lot of that too. So when I left elections in May of 21, I really kind of thought I was walking away. And what happened was I continued to hear from my colleagues in the counties who were asking questions about. They were still getting threats. They were still trying to seek some type of coordination with their local law enforcement and state law enforcement to respond to some of these things. And not just threats, but things like public demonstrations, disruption at polling places, threats of violence, stuff like that. And so I started just talking with them kind of privately about it, and got on some calls with some folks like Neal, and got hooked up with people at the Brennan Center and realized there was a real need out there for this. And so I didn't really plan on getting involved, but what I found is, now that I'm back in the law enforcement world, where I spent 20 years before going into elections, is that really what we need to do is build a bridge between the law enforcement world and the elections world. Because in both groups, you've got very dedicated, conscientious people that are interested in public service. They're interested in doing the right thing. And for too long, they've sort of operated in separate worlds. And fortunately, because for a long time, elections have been civil events where there hasn't been a lot of incivility. And unfortunately, they've become less civil. in practice. And so what I've been trying to do in some of the presentations and appearances I've done is to inform law enforcement what election officials need to know about them, and vice versa, what election officials need to know about law enforcement, so that they can work together. I know that in Georgia and in other states, there hasn't always been a real happy marriage with law enforcement and elections based on some historical precedent. And so it's not something that you can just throw a bunch of cops at the problem and hope you're going to make it better. But when both sides understand the limitations and the specialties and the needs of each one, they can really work together. And I've seen it happen in a couple of counties in Georgia, and I think we're building a lot of momentum. So I'm just like Neal said, I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation and the larger part of the committee. So thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, to build on what Neal and Chris said really eloquently, and I have to agree with Chris, there is becoming a greater and greater relationship, sadly, but importantly, between law enforcement and our election officials. But this committee and efforts like it developed quite naturally and pretty quickly as well. We all witnessed the rhetoric and the threats leveled towards officials like Neal and Chris during the 2020 election. And at that time, I was coterminously president of Major County Sheriffs of America, a national group of the larger sheriffs in the country, as well as president of Mass Sheriffs Association, which when I think about that year is pretty, I guess you don't realize how insane it is if you're doing it day to day. When you think back, you realize that was how crazy that was to be doing at that time, but it informed me a lot. And many of us felt these threats represented a real public safety issue, both in Massachusetts, but really across the nation. Our responsibility is to respond to those just as we would any threat of violence. So law enforcement leaders across the country did just that in various ways. I know that Neal worked with his sheriff, my good friend Don Barnes, and Alberto Martinez of the Orange County Intelligence Assessment Center to monitor threats. I worked with attorneys general and secretaries of state to form the Voter Protection Project, now the State's United Democracy Center, to speak out about the rise in political violence related to domestic violence extremism. And then the Brennan Center brought together both law enforcement and elections officials to form CSSE, which is giving us a chance to look forward on critical questions about election security. To back up the points Chris and Neal made, this is a critical juncture, not just for election security, but for the safety. Who'd ever thought we'd come to this, not just for election security, but for the safety of election officials and truly for our democracy. This is why the work of the Elections Assistance Commission is so invaluable right now. And Mr. Chairman, I just thank you for what you and your team have done for us on this front, and look forward to the work we will continue to do together in the future as well.
Thank you. The thing I didn't speak about was that, Mr. Kelley, you are also a retired law enforcement officer, which was not in your bio there, but wanted to thank you for your service as a law enforcement officer as well. For the former election officials, can you describe how you, your offices, and your staff dealt with threats that occurred during and after the 2020 election season?
It was quite an interesting time, as the sheriff pointed out. 2020 was a blur in some cases, but following the election in the fall in 2020, we had hundreds of protesters show up at my office on several days, looking at the ballot counting as the contest became closer, as the rhetoric increased across the country. The protests continued, and I did work with Orange County Sheriff's Department and our intelligence folks on understanding the threats that were coming in and where these protests were going to be taking place. When it started to get personal, nothing like my friends and colleagues in Georgia and Michigan and Pennsylvania, but it still rattles you. Receiving physical threats is just not something you're prepared for, I think, in any circumstance. But when you're counting ballots, it's the last thing you should be thinking about, to be honest with you. And when I was told by the Sheriff's Department, look, we're going to follow you wherever you go. We're going to follow you if you go get a sandwich. These are the kinds of things that really raise red flags for you. And so what I did is to form a really tight partnership with our local, state, and federal partners in advance of the election to really understand the threat landscape, but also to increase our physical security. Now, not every office has that opportunity. And that's one of the reasons I think CSSC is really important, to start providing ideas, checklists, solutions for counties and localities that may not have the resources that I had in Orange County. But that being said, I think it's all scalable. I think there's things you can do with your local partners to improve the security and threats against your office. I will say that it rattled my staff as well. It's not just me, it's not just election officials, it's the frontline workers that are doing this day-to-day work that's really important. And there's some people that didn't want to do it anymore. And that's really frustrating and concerning. The last thing I will say is that it's important that you have a plan. I think election officials far too often do great jobs of planning for getting ballots out, counting them, tallying them, but we're not thinking so much about other things that are really important. And so now's the time as we head into these upcoming elections to start doing that additional thinking.
Yeah, we had a unique experience in Georgia. When I look back on the last 5 or 6 years, the threat for cybersecurity was at the top of the list for everyone. Every NASED conference was, everything with Homeland Security was all about cyber. And we had a really good response to that. We got a lot of support from CISA. We got a lot of support from the EAC. We got a lot of support from Homeland Security. We got support for physical security assessments. We had every county in Georgia complete a physical security assessment with DHS. And so we really moved the ball on that front. And then all of a sudden, the physical security and the threat issue came up, and that was something that I don't think anybody was really prepared for. I know when I was sitting in the Georgia Emergency Management Office on January 4th. That was the afternoon before the federal runoff between Loeffler and Perdue and Ossoff and Warnock, and sort of the eyes of the country were again on Georgia. And I got a call from Amy Cohen, our good friend, who said, Chris, you've just been threatened by the enemies of the people. And I checked my personal email, and I had a message from them telling me that they had given me the holidays off, and now they were going to come for me, and I should tell my family goodbye every time I saw them. And they put a picture of my house, they put my home address, they put my personal contacts, put a picture of me with the crosshairs over my face. And so I got off the phone with Amy, and I called my local city police department. And within an hour, I had a marked police car in front of my house that they kept there for about 2 weeks. I certainly I had my wife and 4 kids at home during that time. And of course, I was going to be, in the office for the next several days after having been, in the office most of the time in between. As most people know, the Secretary Raffensperger had 24-hour protection. Other people in our office got threats, and they had 24-hour protection. But like Neal said, we had counties where protesters showed up and they couldn't even move equipment in and out of the buildings because you had these crowds that were gathering, that were thronging the offices. We had an incident where a film was caught on Twitter where a poll worker was going through absentee ballots, and he was discarding the instructions that people had returned with their absentee ballots. And somebody said, "Oh, this guy is he's throwing away ballots because he crumpled up this." And this guy, he's a 30-something-year-old guy. He was on Twitter, and within hours, all his information was online. He was getting harassed. He was getting stopped in traffic, and that went on all over the place. And so what I realized was that we've got to take the same approach, or a similar approach, to this issue of physical threats, physical security, and threats that we took with cybersecurity, because that was a really successful program, and it's going to take some work to get everybody on the same page. In my conversations with election officials certainly around Georgia, and in some cases around the country, we've got to make sure that the election folks know that they don't have to put up with this. It's a crime to threaten somebody, and the police need to understand that it's a crime to threaten somebody, even if it's over, an election thing. And I call it the new form of domestic violence. It's people. Cops are used to going to domestic violence calls and handling those and taking them very seriously. Well, we've gone from a time 2 or 3 years ago when, these threats weren't really real. I don't think people really took them seriously. But I can tell you, when your name and your house and your address is online from the Enemies of the People website, and there are a whole lot of people in Georgia that aren't really happy with you. You know, I sort of joked and said, hey, when I became a cop in '94, I learned to tell my family goodbye every time I loved them every time I left the house, because I didn't know if I'd come home. I kind of thought I'd left it behind a little bit when I went into elections, but it was an easy habit to pick back up. And so that's why I'm so excited and so committed to this work, so that the election officials realize you don't have to put up with this. But in order to work effectively with law enforcement, there's some things law enforcement needs for you to do with them. A lot of pre-planning and pre-coordination. Just real quickly, I went up to Hall County, Georgia. It was about an hour north of Atlanta a couple of months ago, and they had in their county emergency management office, they had the election officials and they had the sheriff's office. And I mean, they had everything down. They had every polling place. They had overhead shots of every polling place. They had the area demarked where you couldn't have campaigning or anything. And you know, they were good to go, and they knew they had radio communication. They knew exactly what was going on, and that was a wonderful example of both sides working together towards a common end, so that everybody knows what's going on. And those are the kinds of things that I think we need to push in building these bridges and informing law enforcement. The last thing is that, you know, in Georgia, and as I've learned in a lot of other laws, there are specific violations of law in the election code that no cop has ever heard of. Neal did a great job in Orange County producing these pocket cards that he distributed to law enforcement that had things like intimidation of voters, illegal campaigning, interfering with election officials. I can tell you, I'm the deputy director of Georgia Post, and I can tell you no police officer in Georgia gets any of that training in the academy. They got a lot of other stuff they got to learn, but that's not one of them. And so the police officer need to understand that they have obligations. They actually have legal obligations in Georgia to take action if some of this stuff is going on. They're not aware of it. The election officials just assume that cops know everything, like everybody else assumes cops know everything. But get them talking and make sure that everyone understands where the other side's coming from.
Great. Sheriff Koutoujian, did you want to talk a little bit about this, or?
Yeah, let me just, I'll just say briefly, I like Chris's analogy. You know, domestic violence was always a crime, but society and law enforcement didn't really know how to deal with it. We're kind of in that place right now. It was always a crime, but then we had to develop laws and policies to make sure they were protecting the victims of that crime, that it was clear about how to do so. Now, I got to be honest with you, this is an issue that's very personal to me. While I didn't serve in the way that Neal and Chris have as an election official, my dad was my hometown city clerk for 30 years in my city of Waltham here in Massachusetts. And I literally grew up in the clerk's office. Even once he retired, he was the person the Secretary of State's office relied upon when there was a vacancy in another clerk's office, or there was a question about elections law, or they needed someone to oversee an election. He was the man who proudly served his community and other communities and saw Election Day as his personal Super Bowl, right? And it instilled in me a respect and appreciation for our democratic process. And I have a lot of fond memories of working with my dad as an election monitor, both in Massachusetts and even as far abroad as Armenia, working for OSCE. It was a real thrill of a lifetime to be doing that, especially with my dad. And I remember learning from him how to maintain and set up the old gear and lever voting machines. Whenever I bring this up, even in the elections crowds, like I realized just how old I am, because they don't even know about these old machines. They were huge. They were used in Massachusetts well into the 80s until the Votomatic machines took over. And by the way, there were never any problems with them. They always worked perfectly efficiently, and no one could ever question anything that went on with these old machines. I still remember the weight of the lever that pulled the curtain around the booth, and of all the individual levers and the intricate mechanics. And these were huge, bulky machines, but it was unbelievable. The engineering and efficiency of the design were something really special. And what I have this really fond memory, because when I would say I'm going, or if they break down, he'd say, remember, we don't say we're fixing voting machines, we repair them. What I find is so that, those words 30 years later were so prescient that now this is what we have to worry about. So I couldn't stand by while election officials and clerks like my father and folks like Chris and Neal and volunteers and everyday citizens are working at the polls, sometimes volunteering and sometimes being paid small amounts of money. This is not their full-time profession, and they're being threatened and harassed. I can't imagine this happening to my dad. And I honestly, what I really because I've seen the stories of some of our election officials whose family and children were threatened, and how much it hurt them, and seeing the emotion that took over them, and the fear and the worry that they had for their family members. And I think about my dad, like, how would he have felt had we been threatened? But really, it just made me really upset as a voter and as a citizen. And as you noted, Chairman, these threats have not fully subsided either. You can see them recounted through congressional testimony and still being leveled against election officials this past spring during local elections, as well as in reference to upcoming state and federal elections this fall. And from the law enforcement community, we have to be clear. We have to make sure that we have the right laws in place and the right training to know how to utilize and enforce those laws, and protecting those officials and monitors and all those people that are involved with elections, because threats of violence have no place in our community, whether they're election related or not. And, in law enforcement, we need to make sure that we're following up on threats of violence as appropriate and protecting these individuals, and thus protecting our democracy. This is at the core of our entire democracy. And if we don't protect here, there's a lot of people have always said, well, we don't have to worry about democracy in America, right? We can make it through anything. And I think we're seeing that that's not necessarily true. And if we're not protective and careful about what we do now, this great experiment of the United States of America could, is more fragile. I believe we're more fragile than we think we are. And I'm seeing that now more than ever before.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really powerful words. Neal or Chris, what sort of impact did these threats have on your families?
I mean, it has a big impact. I don't think anybody that has received a threat could not say that it has a big impact. It really brought fear to my wife. It brought fear to just our home life, and looking around and wondering, as you're out in public, who might be targeting you, or it just really raises the hair on your back, which is scary. It didn't. I will say this, and I want to really commend my staff, because even though we were under this constant level of threats and this harassment that was going on, they put their heads down, they did their work, and focused on the thing that we do best as election officials, and that is running a fair and accurate election. And we didn't let that get in the way, but it does rattle you, and it does cause a tremendous amount of concern. I had some good conversations with a friend in Michigan, and she's had protests outside of her house. Well, I didn't have that, but when you add threats and then protests outside of your own personal space, your home, that's really going to shake you up. And so it just makes it a more frightening experience. I don't think that we want to keep going down this path without addressing it very aggressively, because we don't want to lose good men and women that are doing this work on a daily basis because of these threats. As the sheriff pointed out, democracy is fragile, and I think we're at a tipping point right now, and we need to be, hyper aware of these issues.
Yeah, for me, I mean, having worn a badge and gun for most of my career, my family was maybe a little bit more used to something like that. This is after a year of COVID. All the kids were home from school. We were kind of crammed into the house. We weren't, two of the kids were at college, and so they were back home, and so we had a full house. We'd had some. My wife had been diagnosed with cancer in October, so she was successfully treated and is doing well now. But that's one more thing on top of everything else that's going on in Georgia at that time. We got a lot of support from the local law enforcement. Like I said, the city of Decatur Police Department, where I live, they were jam up. I called the chief seconds after I got the call. I think I actually called the FBI first. Talked to our responding agent, who had been assigned elections, who I'd worked with very well throughout the year, let her know what was going on, asked for her help, and then called the City of Decatur Police Department, and they sent cars, and they increased patrols, and they said, whatever you need, we'll do. So I felt relatively safe. I wasn't so much worried that the enemies of the people were necessarily gonna come up and get me. But when stuff like that's on the dark web, you never know who's gonna be 20 miles away and say, hey, I know where that is. Let's go mess with this guy's house. Let's go mess with his family. Let's go mess whatever. And so it was really the last thing that anybody needed working in elections. It's not like we hadn't been through enough. and then again, to see other people in the state, in our office, go through the same thing was, it was pretty demoralizing, frankly. But like Neal said, the number one job was to do the job, and get it done. And so that's what we did. But I can tell you, as Neal said, in Georgia, I think 5 of the largest counties have new election directors this year. Now some of it's kind of natural retirement. Some of it was specifically because they didn't want to put up with the threats anymore. So we lost probably hundreds of years of experience in Georgia in some of the largest counties and in other small counties too, as a result of what went on, and the threats, and then the badgering and the harassment. I mean, you've got the threats, which are a criminal thing, and then you also have just the constant badgering and harassment. We've got counties that have been just overwhelmed with open record requests. They've spent most of their time, they're still getting open record requests for 2000. And so it's really impeding their ability to move forward and get ready for this fall. So it really does have a lingering effect. And I hope that maybe as more people become aware of this, that people that may not have any real criminal intent, but just like to be rabble rousers and keyboard warriors, realize you're really gumming up the works if you're just trying to harass these folks. These are some of the most earnest, hardworking, dedicated people that I work with. They're a lot like cops. I mean, they're not perfect. They don't do everything perfectly. They make mistakes. It's an election is thousands of people, tens of thousands of people doing something on one day and hoping to get it perfectly right. People are going to forget to fill out a form, and somebody's going to make a mistake. But if you want to contribute to the process, what I tell everyone, every single person that has questioned the election outcome in Georgia, I say, call your county election office and volunteer to be a poll worker. Sign up to be a poll worker. Get on the front lines and see if any of this stuff that you think exists, and be there to keep it from happening if you think it's happening. And not many people have taken me up on the offer, but that's the first thing I say is pick up a rifle and stand a post if you're concerned about this going on. So I share Sheriff Koutoujian's concern about the direction we're heading. And I really hope that people can take a step back and get out of their partisan mindsets and realize we've got to keep this process as pristine as possible and as passionless as possible. Let's go through the process. We can deal with the results afterwards. If your guy wins or your gal doesn't win, there are ways to do that politically. But let's keep the process fairly intact.
And
Hey,
Mr.
Commissioner,
Chairman,
can
let me just
Oh, I'm
add,
sorry, sure, go
I'd
ahead.
like to just say a little something too, because, these are two pretty strong people that are speaking right now, and election officials across this country, amazing, strong people. But is something really upsetting and powerful when you see these very people breaking down in tears and telling their story, right? And by the way, it's never the threat to them that they're as worried about. It's their threat to their families. And when you see these noble public servants that never expected to be in these positions, whose children are being threatened, whose children are being placed on the internet, whose children are attending college in my county, and they're worried about threats to their own children, right? And then when they tell their story, I would cry openly. I telling the very same story, worrying about my own children, right? That's what people don't really see. They think about it, it's very ethereal, it's very intellectual. It's not emotional to people because they don't get to see that. And unfortunately, as Neal and Chris would know, the stress from the threat or perception of impending violence is something we know well in law enforcement. And, we address it a lot, right? And I think that one of the things that we could probably do better by election workers is to support them, right? In the Middlesex Sheriff's Office, we run a hybrid wellness model, which combines like robust peer support along with an employee assistance program using professional counselors and support systems during times of crisis. And I just think that, sadly, secretaries of state like Bill Galvin, I know, has been putting resources towards his troops. This is now what we have to be thinking about in protecting the well-being, not just the physical well-being, but the emotional and mental health well-being of those people that are there. People aren't understanding how this is affecting individuals, and then truly affecting their families, affecting individuals, and affecting our systems of election days, and then all those days prior, and then right after that too.
And Commissioner, can I just add something to the great comments that the sheriff and Chris have made? One of the things that I don't think we're talking about enough is the things that we don't know. So for instance, Chris talked about the rabble rousers and the ones that continue to bring this forward and are doing it to really harass. But God forbid, and I think it's a conversation worth having, you know, somebody who has some sort of mental instability could be triggered by these constant discussions and harassment threats. And it's those people, in addition to what we're dealing with now, that is of concern and something you think about on a daily basis.
Yeah, I can tell you on when we were certifying the November election, I had to disguise myself and sneak the paperwork into the Capitol through an angry crowd that I'm sure if they had known who I was and what I was doing in order to get them signed, I would have encountered violence. So it's really out there.
Well, that's a real shame. I'm really sorry. Thank you all for all you've done to protect our elections and our safety overall. And anyone who's watching this video to know that we have on our page ways to serve as a poll worker. We ask you to volunteer to do that, but also for any election official who's out there who may need some sort of help mentally getting through this, we have that sort of information as well on our webpage as well. So I don't know if any of you want to describe some of the impacts that threats of violence have had on your workers' mental health or just overall, or we can move on to the next series of questions as well. All right, so what are some of the signs for election officials to recognize that they may need to seek counseling or some sort of mental health professional help?
I think you need to be honest with yourself. If the day is becoming too long and you're overwhelmed and you're feeling stressors at home and you're feeling those stressors at the office, that may be time that you need to slow down and seek some assistance. Even if you're not directly facing these threats of violence, that harassment that is occurring to your colleagues and your friends, this can affect you directly as well. And you might be concerned about that coming your way. So I personally found that having ongoing relationships with family and close friends, and that really helps, and not necessarily needing that mental support professionally, but just being around friends and family that care about you is really important, and not forgetting that.
You know, in Georgia, in my current job with the Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, we started about a year and a half ago a really robust resiliency program that's designed to help police officers and sheriff's deputies and all law enforcement officers in the state deal with some of the stress, because you know it's common in the law enforcement world too. And you've got substance abuse, you've got suicide, you've got marital problems, all the family disintegration, and I'm afraid that's kind of coming down the pike for some election officials. I think for me, the most important thing was just talking to people and just sharing what had gone on, because most people, I don't say they didn't think I was lying, but they couldn't believe the kind of stuff that we were getting. Even neighbors where I lived, when they found out what was going on, they were just gobsmacked that somebody would do that kind of stuff. As you know, in the best of days, running elections is very, very stressful. You've got thousands of people looking for the slightest misstep you're going to make, so that the stress is already ratcheted up to 11, and then you get some of these people that want to pour some fuel on the fire. They make it worse. But I know in Georgia, the local election officials have really strong networks. They have prayer groups where they pray for each other, and I can't tell you the number of calls I got from people in the second half of 2020 from county election officials just saying, "I'm just calling to check in. How are you doing? How are you holding up with this?" And I can't tell you how much that meant to me. And I tried to turn around and do it to other people too, and just check in with them. But just check with your colleagues, and talk about what's going on, have lunch together, get a group together, and just kind of vent and get it all out there, and know that you're not alone, because it can feel pretty darn isolating when you've got the eyes of the world on you, and you've got people threatening you, and you've got, people proclaiming, the end of the world based on what you release as the election results, as if it's anything that I have any control over, as if I'm making these decisions. It's, you're doing the process, you're counting the ballots that are cast by the voters, but it can be pretty isolating. And I would recommend any kind of activity that gets you out of that doom spiral, because it's there.
So I would say that a couple of things. One, creating a space to gather and discuss issues, which is exactly what the Brennan Center and CSSE have provided. I think it was therapeutic in many of these meetings that I was in to watch people actually express themselves and to share. I could tell that they felt a lot better and their colleagues felt a lot better in that sharing as well. But then also there could be the sharing of best practices and the coordination of best practice responses, which is important. I've spoken with other law enforcement leaders, and even some gatherings, just as we do for other major events like the Super Bowl or university commencements, tabletop exercises that law enforcement and election officials can run together in advance of election day to prepare for that. This is something we do in law enforcement all the time, and I think we're now stepping into this field. I think that's a practical way to ensure that we're prepared should a threat become actualized. And then very lastly, I mentioned it before, but I think it bears repeating, having a professional resource, employee assistance program to have for those people that are being affected. But really importantly, because a lot of people, don't think they're being affected, or they'll suck it up. And especially men are much less emotive, and, and they don't really know when they need help. Women are much more intelligent, emotionally intelligent on issues like that. They might know that they need help, but guys will refuse to do it. One of the things that I just wrote it down, was that you make sure that the families are aware to watch out for them. And I think what we've also done well in our shop is create that peer support network, so that whether there's a major incident or not, if there is, of course, we send in peer support just to check all around all the different shifts to make sure everyone's okay. But if they know someone's going through a hard time, their peers can step in and watch out for them, and then speak to them about referring them to a higher level of therapy should there be the need. I have seen people that have been going through a very bad time and really struggling, and then gotten that help. I mean, some of the toughest guys in my own operation, in their careers, in their lives, changed 180% from a really bad, dark place to a really bright, happy place. And I think that we just have to be watching out for each other, providing those resources, but then engaging and letting the family know to watch out for those signs, because we know a lot of these people won't do it themselves. But if we have their peers or their family members watching out for them, they can step in and do the right thing to help that person out.
Great. Are there any other resources that election officials and law enforcement officers would find helpful? Is there anything else in development that you know of?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, Commissioner, and I first want to talk about one of the successes that we've had, and that is with law enforcement pocket guides. It may sound simple, but just to give you kind of a brief background on that, if you're ever pulled over on the highway by a state trooper, you can rest assured, most likely that trooper has a pocket guide in their shirt pocket that reminds them of commonly used vehicle code sections, infractions. Now, these officers use that on a daily basis. They probably really don't need that pocket guide, but it's there as a reminder. Think about elections. We just talked about these are single day events every 2 years in some cases. Law enforcement officers are not dealing with it on a daily basis like they are with everything else. I was on a call in Orange County one time, and there was a voter intimidation call, and 911 was called by some folks at the polling place. And I showed up, and there were patrol officers on the scene, and they pulled me aside and they said, "Isn't this a civil issue? I don't even know if this is a criminal issue." That's no fault of theirs. They're just not dealing with it on a daily basis. So these pocket guides we've created with criminal code sections on there in the election space for law enforcement officers. We distributed them in Orange County to all 34 cities, and every single beat officer had one of those in the lead up to election day. And now they've spread across the country. We're seeing it in Wisconsin, we're seeing it in Michigan and other states. And CSSE is going to be focused on getting these pocket guides even further out there. Two more things I want to talk about. The second is a briefing or a training video that could really inform election officials and law enforcement for things to look out for. What can you do as election officials and law enforcement if these threats of harassment or harassment continue to grow? And this training briefing video will be focused on sort of high level, the low hanging fruit and what you can do immediately to protect yourself and how law enforcement can help. And we're working on that and developing that now. And I will say there's a lot of other things, to be honest with you, Commissioner, just from your physical security as an election official, having a crisis communication plan, making sure they're in your standard operating procedures for the run up to the election, just like you are producing ballots, have that law enforcement partnership and bridge as a part of your planning. Monitor web, social, traditional media is something that's very important because a lot of the threats and a lot of the rhetoric start there. And if you are in partnership with your local law enforcement, they have some great intelligence folks in many parts of the country that can do that for you and keep you aware on those threats. And so bottom line is there's a whole series of things that we would like to work on at CSSE, checklists and the things I've described to just really improve the process and to provide valuable products and services, not just provide lip service, but actually make something that's worthwhile.
Great.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've tried to do is from the law enforcement perspective, as I mentioned before, they don't know much about elections generally. When you point out the fact that again, in Georgia, for example, we've got 3 weeks of advance voting before election day. We've got, weeks of absentee voting. You've got equipment stored over here. You've got logic and accuracy tests happening on this day. And what I tell law enforcement is if you ask your county election officials, they will give you a calendar and a map and a location where everything is happening. So there's no reason for you not to know when and where everything is happening and to be prepared to respond if you have an emergency situation. And on the election side, hey, if you get a threatening call, if you get a threatening email, if you get a threatening message, save it and give it to law enforcement because they're not thinking about it as evidence. They're going to call and say, well, this guy said he was going to come mess with me. Well, did you have the text? No, I deleted the text because I didn't want to look at it. Well, that's not helpful. I understand it, but get them thinking a little bit more about law enforcement, get the law enforcement thinking a little bit more about elections, and have both sides helping each other. But I really think a lot of the initiative needs to be on the law enforcement side, saying how can we help? The election officials are pushed to the limits as it is with the demands and the multiple locations and the people and all this stuff going on. And I really encourage the law enforcement people to kind of take the initiative, reach out to the election officials and say, how can we help? And they'll give you a list of everything that's going on with a timetable, with a schedule, with a location, and it's up to you to see how you can help with that.
I think that's great because I thought back to when you said about the deleting of the text, how most of us have seen these CSI shows and the preservation of evidence, and I think that's where people understand that, and if you preserve this evidence to make things easier for law enforcement later on, that would be very helpful. Is there anything else, gentlemen, that you would like to add before we end this? Well, I want to thank you all for being a part of this, and thank you all for your service to our country, to your individual jurisdictions, and please provide this moving forward. And is there anything that the EAC can do to assist you with this? Please do not hesitate to reach out to me or our fellow colleagues as we move forward through this election cycle and 2024 and beyond. And with that, I would like to thank you and end this.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Commissioner. Thank you.